It doesn't make sense, does it? It doesn't make sense to end the most important story in the world this way. Now, granted, the whole rhythm of the Gospel according to Mark is rather abrupt. And it seems that the evangelist wants us to really understand that even the heroes of the story are rather flawed individuals. But still, the Gospel according to Mark, at least as we have it today, ends in a surprisingly abrupt and rather unsatisfying way, at least at first glance. Indeed, the Gospel accumulated 2 additional endings as time went on that were felt more fitting, because it doesn't make sense. It just doesn't seem right to end the Gospel with these faithful women afraid. But that's how it ends. We just read it. I'll read it again in case you missed it. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. That's the end of the Gospel according to Mark. The women who had provided for him during his ministry were afraid. The women who stayed by Jesus all the way through his suffering and death were afraid. The women who, of course, came to the tomb as soon as they were allowed by law and custom to finish the work of a proper burial for their beloved friend, teacher, and Lord were afraid. The women who were frankly heroic even to have been there early that morning were afraid. And that's it? Fear? Is that the end of the story? Is that the point? To be sure, just about everyone except Jesus is afraid in these last chapters of the Gospel according to Mark. It's as if the evangelist is daring us to explore why human fear is such an important theme in the Gospel. I suspect that when this was written, the courage, the overpowering transformation that had taken place in the lives of those women and the disciples in the years following was well known in Christian circles. And the original recipients of this sacred story needed to be reminded of the source of the transformation that had taken place in their lives. They needed to see clearly that it was Jesus who suffered and died and rose from the dead, who loved them through all their weak and fearful and misguided paths. It was Jesus who was the source of this change. They weren't exceptional people. They were people whose outlook on life and whose values and actions, like ours, whether or not we are self-aware or honest enough to admit it, are colored by fear. For example, the military and political leaders in Jerusalem were afraid. They feared Jesus and his proclamation of a kingdom built on God's vision of justice that threatened to usurp and supplant their sycophantic devotion to an emperor far more concerned with expanding power and controlling the masses than with creating justice. They feared that they would be exposed by Jesus for their greed, their bigotry, their bloodthirstiness, and that the people they oppressed and exploited would finally have the courage to stand up and say no more. They might well have thought, and certainly hoped, on that Good Friday that they had taken hold of all that fear and put it in that tomb with the dead body of the man who represented the biggest threat to their way of life. And those in power running the military occupation of a foreign dictator were certainly not the only ones whose lives were framed by fear. Indeed, there were all kinds of people who simply played along with this oppressive regime, whose lives weren't necessarily that great, but who very much feared the consequences of rocking the boat, and might even have hoped that if they played along with the powerful people in charge, some of that power might rub off. There were even people who put a religious spin on the fear that drove so much of that society. These self-righteous hypocrites lived in a way that seemed to say that if people followed their twisted interpretations of the religious law, they could be rich and powerful, and even that God was more concerned about their prosperity and safety than about the well-being of any other nation around them. They asserted that the rich and powerful were so because they deserved it, that their wealth and power were incontrovertible evidence that they were better than the common folk. They feared that if someone else taught with godly authority that the Scriptures called people of faith to use their power and privilege to serve primarily those without power and privilege, that they would be exposed for the hypocrites that they were, and that their superficial piety would be seen for the hollow self-centeredness that it was. Oh, different people's fear looked different, just as it does in our day. Very few of us here today live in abject fear. We don't cower in corners, closing our eyes and holding our breath because we're in imminent danger. No, our fears are much more subtle, often beneath the level of consciousness. We might have insecurities or worries or concerns, but those aren't really fears, right? Our minds play amazing games rationalizing fear so that it looks either insignificant or well-intentioned. For example, when we act on an irrational need to manage others' personal choices to conform to our own cultural norms. When we worry that care for the poor and needy will somehow mean a loss for ourselves. When we simply judge others, gossip about others, point fingers at others to get in a preemptive jab or put down, lest they throw one at us first. When we perceive a threat where there's really only a difference of skin color, of religion, or of culture. I can't help but imagine then, given that human fear was such an important part of the framework of the gospel according to Mark, what Jesus would think about our fears and the ungodly ways we often act on them. When I imagine trying to explain these non-fears to Jesus, I can see him looking at me with a look of complete understanding and pure love, ready to tell me the truth. The truth that our insecurities, worries, and concerns can consume us just as much as the fear of those who believed putting Jesus to death would protect themselves. The truth that we will be captive to those fears, however benign we want to convince ourselves that they are, until we own them honestly before God. Then we're ready to more fully hear, understand, and embrace the single most important truth of all. The one absolute, guaranteed, life-changing, eternally and universally powerful truth that the perfect love of God in Jesus, in his life, death, and resurrection, is the one way to cast out and put aside those fears. Apart from that love, we will have fear in whatever guise we put it, and however conscious of it we might or might not be. Jesus' resurrection, though, promises to completely change all that. Those women and the disciples who fled came to know the resurrection life that Jesus offers each and every one of us. They grew to know deeply in that resurrected life the pure love of God. And in letting the light of that love of God shine in and through them, they were no longer captive to their fears, not even to their insecurities or their worries or their concerns. This love of God in Jesus conquers death. It conquers hate. It conquers all the principalities and powers of this world that would foment division and promote the fear of others. That's right. In the kingdom of God's perfect love, there is room for each and every person, even you and me. But there simply isn't room for fear. Can you imagine living a life free of worries about other people, about what they might think of us, free of anxieties about the future, free of the us, them, win, lose ways we so often see the world around us? Can you imagine being so steeped in unconditional love as to be free of fear for our safety and well-being? So shaped by God's love for us that our lives could be characterized only by those fruitful qualities of living in God's loving Spirit that St. Paul describes in his letter to the Galatians, you may know them: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. The Gospel according to Mark eloquently, if surprisingly, leaves us with the fear of those courageous women, and thereby with the invitation to reflect on our own fears, or insecurities, or worries, or concerns. But the story of the resurrection doesn't end there. My sisters and brothers, Christ is risen, and in his resurrection, he has given us the promise of a life free of fear in whatever form we hold on to it. He has given us the promise of a life lived fully in the eternal love of God, who in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus frees us to receive and share that love of God without fear, equally, unconditionally, and eternally.